much, and I'm still pretty active in Australia at the moment. I might just share and just ask if you can see, just ask if you can see the screen.
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And this is a pretty cool opportunity. Appreciate it. And it takes me back to a number of years ago when I did had a conversation right at your place in San Luis Obispo. So I know where you're at. I know your beautiful little town and your institution there. And Bill has come and visited me in New Zealand as well on his way through doing some research on the earthquakes. And so this is a great privilege for me. Thank you. So I thought just to really to set a little agenda that makes me thinking, because I think we're all a bit traumatized by what's happening around us. And I just want to share just some of my early thoughts. This is just me speaking, so don't think this is science. But I've got a strong intuition that there's a little bit too much knee-jerk thinking going on at the moment, knee-jerk responses to COVID, and people coming out with stories about, oh, we'll never have high density again, no more public transport, all the rest. And I think we've got to be careful with that, because I think it's quite short term. We don't know how this evolves. We're hoping, obviously, for a vaccine. And I remind you, for those of you who can remember September 11, after September 11, we were never going to build another tower block again. And we've built probably more since than was built up to September 11 in the world. So I think we've got to be careful with the physical response. There will be some, obviously, in the medium term. In the long term, I'm not sure. And the reason is, I think that there's such underlying pressures and dynamics that will keep us having to make cities which are more consolidated, more connected up, more efficient. And I think those underlying drivers are not going to go away. And in addition, things don't change that quickly. You can't just change the world and the physical layout of the world. The other thing that's driving me nuts is everybody's just repeating their existing agendas, and so everybody's using it on the left, on the right, and whether it's green or whether it's sort of ultra right, or whether it's free enterprise, just using this as saying, well, now you see my agenda is really the one that counts. And I think we owe it to ourselves just to step back and try and think clearly for ourselves, and I'm desperately trying to work through that. And that forces us to have to reevaluate our principles. And I don't think it means we throw them away, but I do believe we have to think them through. I think there are some things we can say with certainty. We will have greater need than we had before, and we'll have fewer resources. Simple statement, but that statement does make us focus somewhat more sharply on what is more critical and what is a sort of a nice to have, if you like. Secondly, I think certainty is the social stress is going to be significant in many, many places around the world, probably everywhere will be an increase. And therefore, whatever we do, what is it we can contribute to the social conditions? And I think the third big thing is that focus on social issues is going to compete, the resources applied to social issues, unemployment, and the social issues that come with that, will compete with the environmental and the climate change agenda. And as professionals, we're going to have to see how we can finesse that, try and find win-win approaches, and in that process, see if how we can be of service to our communities. When in a simplistic way, again, there's no science here, there are no numbers behind these. This is just my intuitive kind of feel about, and I have been thinking, like all of us, just how do we see the global challenges out there, of which we only participate in a small component. And in some other work that I'm doing, this is sort of just a brainstorm for myself, and I kind of divided simply into planet issues and people issues, and in this particular list, which I'm not going to go through. But the thing that I think is encouraging, and I deal with a lot of young professionals, and I deal a lot with trying to give them help and try to hope, I guess, and a little bit help in terms of ways of trying to think about how to engage with a world which can be pretty depressing and daunting if you just look at all the headlines that are constantly coming through, even prior to COVID. And I think the challenge for us is to try and seek out those local opportunities that have some connection with the global challenges, rather than just frivolously dealing with things because you like them. I think sometimes you've got to pick a diet which is healthy for you, as opposed to just it tastes good. And so that thread between local and global, and by the way, a little local issue in a market in Wuhan has become a global, has a global outcome. And that applies less radically, but to many other things. The local action in biodiversity can actually be something that helps at a global level or make its contribution. And I think that's a line which is quite useful, just in terms of how you orientate yourself, especially as a younger urban professional. When I look at those twin peaks earlier on, and if I just again intuitively step back, nothing new in this, but if I were to crystallize what are the sort of the three big kind of issues, and they clearly sit for me in climate change being such a existential challenge for us, the erosion of nature, which we depressingly just hear about and see on an ongoing basis, loss of biodiversity, species extinction, water quality, and so on. And of course, we've got good examples in all of these, but when you add it up globally, it's not a great picture. And then poverty itself, but poverty, we've got to be careful we don't just bundle that into the homeless or the or people at the very, very bottom end. There's a continuum there, which I think we need to give consideration to, the working poor and so on as well. And I've just said poverty and quality of life as a sort of a way of trying to describe that. And those three things obviously have interrelationships, and they don't sit that comfortably with each other. They're often in competition. Climate change can, has its own pressure on nature. If you keep building, as we all love, wind generators, but they have their own implications. They also consume energy. They also can be destructive to nature and biodiversity and so on. Obviously, they're more a good thing than a bad thing, but there are interrelationships. Climate change refugees and the poor are least equipped to absorb those challenges, and so that relationship with poverty is obviously very strong. The erosion of nature, which again can weaken nature itself in its resilience to deal with climate change. So we can be contributing to climate change not just through carbon, but through our other actions which undermine nature. And biodiversity needs often compete with the needs of the poor. And so they often, so often the poor actually need to be chopping down trees in order just to survive from a heat perspective or cooking their food, but they're diminishing biodiversity. And somewhat these things in reverse. Consumption depletes nature and generates pollution and waste. Well, we understand that, but the poor are also consumers. It's not just the rich. And so those are often very uncomfortable relationships which we need to think through. And the same applies between poverty and climate, I guess. And you'll be able to read this on screen afterwards. But again, these are these are just me. You know, you're not going to find this in another document, and they're just somewhat just an accumulated, hopefully, an accumulated sort of common sense. My interest dates back very far, and I'm sorry Bill's not here, and some of the others may be of a gentle age, that they can think back to the 70s when there was actually a far stronger awareness, I think, about the environment, and in the anti-nuke times, but also just the environment in general. And I grew up in that generation in Africa with challenging politics and issues and human rights issues. And I chose against the grain for my university to deal with squatter issues and squatter camps and such, and very quickly realized this interrelationship between these social issues and the environment. And some of my early work there was to try and accumulate information. This is just at university still. And to try and set up my own little ecology of everything that I could think of that could practically contribute to generating energy, in this case, methane generators off farming and crops, fish that feed off some of those, even some of the nutrients, gathering your own water, and so on and so on. I also grew up on a farm, so I had an early understanding of this in a kind of intuitive way of the ecological connections. And we built some of these things, and some of the other things are borrowed things, and Victor Papanek was a favorite at the time, and still a wonderful author to read his work if you can. I still find it inspiring. So that connection between environment and social, or poverty in that case, was actually sort of quite early on embedded, and I was sort of living and worked in the townships. I grew up on the farm, and so for me that that kind of hasn't gone away through my, call it, first world experience. I think that test also, this little quote that I just picked up in The Guardian in April this year: economic growth, aggregate effect of the quest to accumulate capital and extract profit. Capitalism collapses without growth, yet perpetual growth on a finite planet leads inexorably to environmental calamity. And I think it's kind of stating what we know, but I think this is put quite sharply. And so this is the tension between economics growth and the environment. And I think the other tension is between the social issues and growth as well. If you're not aware of Michael Green's social progress indicators, you'll find him on TED, and where he measured 52 social conditions in 133 countries. And those conditions are sort of the things you'd expect under these headings. It's quite interesting in terms of the findings, because on the left-hand side is the social progress against those headings. And so if you look at how countries, just vertically look how well countries do, and this is not an advert for New Zealand, but New Zealand does pretty well. But when you put that against GDP, which is a useful thing to do, and you look at GDP, Kuwait being very high in the GDP, USA being pretty, just short, again leading the pack, and you look at GDP versus social indicators, effectively how kind a country is to its own people, then you see an interesting graph. One incredible example is Costa Rica with pretty low income. See the low income to the left here, but pretty high score, and they're actually the exception on this map for me. But disappointingly, places India, China, and so on, Russia, could do much better. And when you look at the curve, and this is really the point for me, is that curve flattens out. And that's telling us that as your GDP grows, the social benefits diminish. And so when you start connecting that excessive growth, which is also harmful for the planet, You've got to get to a point where you say, well, hang on, we can't just model this whole thing on growth, even economic growth. And I think what that tells us as professionals is we got to get smarter about the finer grained things we can do that actually provide efficiencies, stronger connectivity, that enable and so on, and that aren't just relied on more money to throw at social problems. And so that for me is, to a degree, frames the balance of this presentation. Don't know if that makes sense to anybody. So if you were to evaluate your principles, so I've got principles coming out of my ears. I think advocacy is spelled wrong. I've got principles coming out of my ears and have been involved, fortunately, from early days, going back now to 94 and shortly thereafter, and have been party to writing some of the earliest urban design principles. And we have a national urban design protocol, which I didn't write. I'm a signatory member, but I did deliver the curriculum around the country, and so on and so on. And I think the point about this is, and those have manifest not only in guidelines, but also have manifest in demonstration projects where I helped do some of the earliest medium density, mixed density, and so on, when everybody was just doing cul-de-sac suburbia. And they accumulated fairly early on into a set of principles, heavily informed, by the way, by responsive environments from Oxford Poly. I'd just come out of that course and also was privileged to teach on that course alongside people like Ivor, who dips in and out, and some of the other noted authors of responsive environments. And these have a strong tribute to them, but being sort of heavily adapted for the New Zealand condition. Now, when I say reevaluate principles, I think probably they're all going to stay intact because they're probably well-meaning, but we've got to ask, are there things that need to be emphasized, lifted up, given more prominence, or are there new principles that we've got to consider? Therefore, I think it's a reevaluation. I'm not saying it's a change necessarily. And I've been working in this direction now for a little while over the last couple of years because of wanting to take this further, because I've found that these principles sort of become a tick box thing. And if you say you do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, that you kind of feel good and you think you're sustainable. And that for me hasn't been helpful when I look at the complex things I've had to work through and the prioritization and weighting. And so for me, I've sort of developed what I've called 4 imperatives. And they kind of sit more as a prioritization mechanism. And I've been finding I've been applying these intuitively. I'm trying to just formalize them for myself. And I think there are 4 of these. And the first one is the most important one. If you've got limited time or limited energy, or the planet has limited time, or you're impatient, then you really have to focus on what's the most impactful. What's going to be transformational, or of a big scale, or is systemic, that brings change which can continue on. And so transformational can be a one-off. You know, if you help a poor person, that can be transformational, but it could be any one of these, just by way of example. It's obviously not all of them. I think the second imperative is efficiency. And so the little map there, that's the Earth, and this is the idea of using the least area on the planet, at least symbolically. And efficiency is about using less space, so we don't have a planet B, less resource, less energy, less consumption, less waste, and putting the right thing in the right place, because that brings about efficiencies. And for me, it kind of sits a little bit second to this one, only because of the impatience. If we had time, these two may swap around. We don't, I believe, have too much time. The next imperative for me is being balanced. I see so many very well-intended, sophisticated people in one field doing things, but often at the expense of other equally important or legitimate needs. dare I say it, the things, you know, if you are behind public transport, as I am, and I've facilitated a lot of public transport initiatives, light rail, all sorts. But if you make that your only focus at the exclusion of other things, you can actually hurt local centres. You can do damage to other things, and our challenge is to be more integrated in that approach. And so that balance, and these circles represent sort of economic, environmental, social, I think is then that next imperative, and to work harder to find a good balance. And then the final one is enriching, because we can do all of these things, and it can be really dull as dishwater, and it can just have no inspiration about it, and have no fun, and even on the serious side, symbolic can be extremely enriching as well. And you talk to the First Nations and just see how important for them these symbolic issues are, because they have almost a spiritual value, and that applies, you know, in many different directions. So just for what it's worth, this is just my ramblings really, and my personal thinking about how to try and deal with, come to grips with reevaluating things, and I'll probably think this through further as COVID progresses. So if I just, so I just want to go now through social, and then the environmental, natural stuff briefly, and then maybe a bit of the climate change stuff just under those three headings. These are all very interconnected, as you'll appreciate, but I'm trying to lift out issues that I think may somehow be more relevant in the current conditions. And as I said earlier, for me, the poor really is about that continuum of you know, from homeless to poor to working poor and to precariat. And that means that, and precariat, I'm assuming, is a term you're familiar with. It's been used for a while. It's about those people on the sort of on the boundaries of poverty and working poor, the lack of predictability, the effects on material and psychological, partially involved in labor, and often do a lot of work without remuneration. A lot of these people probably voted for Sanders and Trump, and for Boris. And there is symptom somehow, and we won't get into that, but there is symptom of, and believe me, they exist in New Zealand as well, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, but they're here. When we look at new employment over the last few years, it's typically been women working part-time on more than 2 jobs, which is incredibly stressful, and so that has implications. And so for me, if you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs or any other, this is a mixture of a few that I've just consolidated. But if you typically simplistically just think of basic needs, well-being, and then the sort of the more elevated self-improvement stuff, that our priority really is at the bottom, I think, as urban professionals. And yes, we can participate up here, but there's often money and other forces that deal with this, and people have their own resources. If we really want to help, this is the area where the help is needed, at the bottom end of those sort of double pyramid. And when you deal with any of these issues, you do have to segregate them or disaggregate them, if you like, into seeing, you know, what the contributing things are. Yes, you can give direct money to the poor, but often you can help the poor more by giving them a job, or by helping with their housing, or helping with their health or education. And so that deserves thinking. And I'm not saying which is right. I'm just saying these are different ways, different approaches to be considered. And I think for us, if we've got that bigger perspective, it's about identifying when there's some of that competition, and I've touched on that already, and things which directly compete with each other, both good things, but they compete, good initiatives, and for us to seek these win-wins, where initiatives actually contribute to, say, poverty, or contribute to the climate, or contribute to biodiversity, or whatever. And so these are diagrams that are sometimes used in complex processes to have the conversation. Don't want to give a talk on integrated planning, but it does start with, I have to preface this by saying the more issues you can look at simultaneously, even if you look at them in quite a shallow way, that's going to help you focus and target your particular focus. In some case, you do this to get region-wide priorities or city-wide priorities. And this is just part of the diagrams of when I do growth planning, working through different disciplines, the headings at the top, and then doing planning scenarios and then testing them against those disciplines and so on. And let me say, if you do this properly, the benefits can be enormous when you do get some sophisticated calculations done on the back of it, which I'll touch on in a second. But seen on a map, in this case, Greater Christchurch, where I did the urban development strategy and pulling together all the key things. This is the farmland, the green of the hills. This is water, underground water, and the city centre and all the centres. And you can see these little Mercedes-Benz things all have different colorings because they have different combinations of initiative. This could be, how much social, how much urban housing, how much employment, and so they all vary. When ultimately when you get, this is the last plan you do out of the whole process. It's a cartoon in a way, but very importantly, that's the social deprivation. Those are the poorest people it's in this sort of band. And the question then is, how do you manipulate and bias your inputs to try and redress that imbalance that exists in the city? And I'll talk more about that. But for me, poverty, this is one of the means where you structurally can be helpful around poverty, providing you have the means to bring it onto the table. That's part of the challenge as a professional. And in this case, getting a sense how the geographic communities, how they really function as opposed to their political delineations. When I did the Melbourne 2030 growth strategy, which I led from New Zealand, which was Melbourne's biggest planning project at the time, probably still was, that was independently measured. That's 500,000 new people and 500,000 existing people around the fringes of Melbourne. And the calculation there was 25 to 43 billion Australian savings to the state of Victoria, 40% less travel, 23% less travel time. Now, this is a projection at the time. Some of this would be eroded. A lot of it was locked in with legal agreements between government departments and different cities, who are all independent cities, sub-cities. And so much of these gains, I'm sure, have flowed through. But this is really about the right thing in the right place. This is kind of coordination. Some of it is sort of cleverness, but a lot of it is actually just the complex thing of organizing things into a simple, connected up approach. And so there can be, a lot of mystique disguising just the hard work that sits behind just that simple thing of getting a balanced outcome. And the numbers are testimony to the impact that delivers. When we focus on social issues itself, what I've been finding is that dealing with all the different disciplines is that the social ones are the hardest to explain graphically. So planners can draw zoning maps and different uses. They love it. And landscape architects can draw biodiversity, green linkages, and so on. And the trans people go nuts on their roading networks. And urban designers on different uses and densities and so on. But the social people, it's not quite easy to depict that graphically. And what that means in the conversation is that they actually lose out because they're not represented strongly enough. So I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to find ways of depicting this so that they can have a stronger voice into the conversation. And so this is looking at sort of 4 quadrants. On the right-hand side, these two are measurable, so you can do them almost desktop as to the list there and how well it's represented in one particular community. The same with leisure and recreation. And the left-hand side is actually judgment, and you need local input for these. You can't do it yourself. And so you've got to sort of do those through little focus groups and things. And accessibility is more than physical accessibility, and sense of community obviously is also not. There's some physical stuff, but and that's quality of place and so on. And the dark areas represents the judgment of how well they're doing, and the light areas is how they could do better. And in this case, the circles are local, just maybe precinct-wide, city-wide, region-wide, and so on. So there's a dimension of scale there. So it takes a little bit to read them, but once everybody in the room sort of understands them, they get a picture. This then represents a picture across a community, and where the local, there's very strong local identity and so on. Where it's very weak, and then you can kind of do something about that. Sometimes 2 communities work in tandem. They're close enough so they can share opposites. One has got health, the other one's got recreation. Don't duplicate it. You don't have the resources, but make sure the connection is strong enough so that dual usage can take place. And so this, for what it's worth, has been a useful tool for us alongside all the other visual tools when we have that conversation. Depicted a bit differently, this is for a blueprint, which is for a whole district, not just one city. And these are smaller towns. And these colors represent where the emphasis is on the intervention. So you can see the colors vary, and once you understand those, it kind of tells you there's quite a bit of industrial happening in these two. The purple, there's some strong community facility stuff happening more in some and less in others, as per the bottom. This is a very wealthy community. That is a very poor community, both those two. So representing those social issues are going to be part, I think, of dealing with poverty. Or I know, and so that we can get some action based on that. When you look at again, this is a blueprint we just recently finished for for Waikato district, the one that I've just shown the map for, and having to deal with all these issues all the way through to governance, very important. That they actually perpetuate and do their bit from a governance perspective. And just to focus on when it gets to employment, and employment has to be part of that, but of course the flip side of employment is unemployment. Employment is obviously a social issue. And one of the big things is the youth. If you look in the blue on the left, youth and other employment, and I'll let you look at this diagram afterwards at your leisure. It's just one of many. But I just wanted to touch on the youth unemployment, which is in many of these areas a big issue, and I believe will become exacerbated with COVID. And that means it's not just a matter of providing a job. It's often to do just with employability. Some people just are not employable. They don't have the routine, they culturally haven't been exposed to if they grow up in extreme poverty. And it's just about developing self-worth at one level. We can go on to the complex programs of bringing employment clusters and all of that stuff, but at another level, if that's not reaching the very bottom end of citizens, then that's not actually helping in a social way. And to get experience, so they've just, and you'll be aware of these, these aren't new, but they've been created specifically for particular conditions in one particular town in this case, 2 towns actually. and to try and get younger people engaged. And I think we're going to have to be looking at these sorts of things more and more after COVID. I did some early work, which then there was a change of government and more conservative thinking, and the more, I believe the more connected thinking was exchanged for more a building program. But working with very complex, poor area and focusing on these sorts of things, again measured independently, was showing some pretty remarkable benefits for the country if one had followed that, that particular program. And so the thing for me here is, you need to work hard on getting these measurements done, because people sort of seem to sit up when it gets to dollars. The compassion will only run so far, but if you can build a case around the money, you've got a far better case with a fuller, authority structure that you worked within. This is a little bit confidential, so I've just flipped the diagram and stuff and taken names off, but I've been privileged to be asked by our housing authority, social housing authority, to look at the 10 sort of poorest communities where there are big concentrations of social housing up and down New Zealand. And so I've done these 10 little strategies, and I'm hoping there's a few more to come. And so you won't understand the colors, but the strategies are to take, so that this is where they'd have a considerable amount of housing. So they may have 400 or 500 houses, social houses, which are now very old and probably require replacing. And where there's a strategy to replace that housing with a third new social housing, a third affordable housing, which is market housing, often assisted, but people, sort of working people and so on, at the bottom end, and then pure market housing, which is open to anybody. But you see at the top there, you triple the density. So you're actually standing still in the social housing provision, but you're increasing another category of housing. And in the standing still, you are replacing it with new housing, high quality, good insulation, and so on. And then how do you employ that to make use of the market forces? How do you employ it to make public spaces safer? In this case, we've got a park in the middle. We're trying to get a road link through the edges of that park because you're hidden away and unsafe. And so you're using the movement to help with safety. There's a little center here. How do you supplement that center to build more diversity? How do you get the market to engage? In this case, there's upmarket housing here, sort of reasonable house. Do you grow it from that? So you kind of creep into it. In other cases, where you come off high movement and enter in with quite a substantial amount where the private sector feel they can create their own identity, but you're actually mixing them with the existing conditions so that you're getting, the whole idea is to reduce the concentration of overdominance of social housing, not to reduce the number, because that reflects a better mix in society. And then, it may look like this. So these are still strategic, but they actually housing typologies, walk-up apartments, terrace houses, and so on. And all this is existing. So those are just existing neighborhood. And these are areas which are currently owned by social housing where this stuff happens. And so I'm quite hopeful for this. The government has put a lot of money into this area. And some of that imagery that comes through may look like that. So those, what I've spoken about, are kind of top-down processes. How do you actually create a structure for bottom-up processes? And this sort of idea of leverage, trying to leverage off local energy. And so every time I work in a community across Australia, wherever, across New Zealand, there's always more aspiration than money, never enough money. And people, dearly want to do more for their communities. But on the flip side, the communities are actually doing a lot themselves, not-for-profits, and voluntary groups are actually doing a lot, and you have that as well. And there's often a disconnect between that and the governance structures or the authorities. And so I've worked quite hard to find some ways to bridge that. And my argument is, if people in the community are offering up their own time to do things, they are probably very legitimate needs in that community. People don't have time to waste or just to do frivolous stuff. And they come home and then they go on to another 2 or 3 hours of working in some charity. And so if a council or an authority can look at those and see which coincide with their own objectives, how can they link with that, not drive them because you'll kill it by trying to take it over, but how can they support, and what are the mechanisms available to them? And so I've kind of categorized these sort of categories. And so the dark is the council or authority, and the light is the community benefit, if you like, as a little depiction. Condition making, that's the underlying conditions. Can you club together to attract capital? You go for and grants and things. Can you influence? And so when it comes through your processes, that you influence them to do things better, because they may be quite amateur at what they're doing, and even influencing developers to do better outcomes. Enabling, where you're actually connecting entities with each other who didn't know or don't have the time because they're just focusing on their one thing. It might be a social thing or an environmental thing. Partnerships, where you actually join in and put some money in, or catalyst investment, where you actually put some money in to allow other things to flow. So the council invests knowing there's going to be a follow-up. And again, these are, I'll leave this on the screen, and I won't go through them given the time constraints. And so this has been helpful for us in terms of being able to find ways of thinking, and so we've had a whole lot of outcomes. We get community, we might get 40 people in from the community, and we have a 2-day workshop, and we just start by saying, what are you doing that you think council can help you do more effectively? Simple as that. And then we start that conversation and distill it down. And so those, so these are youth initiatives that have come out of the leadership initiatives, collaborating between social entities, and environmental initiatives at the bottom left. One of the great ones was this person, bottom right, said, I'm the buyer for the biggest hospital this is in Australia, for the biggest hospital in the district, and I said, and $20 million goes to Sydney every year. And the council said, well, and somebody said, well, we've got to change that. We've got to go online and make local suppliers aware. And the council said, well, we build websites all the time, so we can do that for free. And then the other hospital said, oh, we'll club in. Then the university said, well, we'll club in, and so on and so on. And then one of the governance people said, well, if you want this to work, you've got to go region-wide, not just your city. And then we set this thing up, and it's now won sort of awards and things. And that came out of a 2-day conversation just asking that question. There's a lot of energy in local communities, and they have saved millions, they claim, that's not my quote, that has just been retained in their community. That's a local gain, not some corporate in Sydney. And that leverage, if you can then convince a council to actually see that leverage as part of their financing, this is trying to overcome debt in a financing structure, reduce their efficiencies, ongoing efficiencies with increased revenue, retire some debt, then the leverage, and then only then increase their rates of taxes. And so if you can make that, formalize that in, and so I've managed to do that in some of those processes. And so the idea is that first you get the efficiencies going, but then those leverage things that I've just spoken about, and by the way, they can involve business, developers, government agencies, not-for-profits. And the idea is that if you get those benefits, as per the millions in that one case, but the other accumulated benefits, that from that will come more rates and more tax. and that means your income is widened as a council, and then you widen your investment, and then you do more leverage, and so it becomes circular in your prospects of dealing as an authority, which are those are really, it's not a business, those are its aims as an authority. And the little thing that I use, they accuse me of making the brain too big when I'm in Australia. But I say, if this is a councillor in a city council, the challenge is that their position is informed only a little bit by evidence-based, a lot by their constituency bias, people who voted them in, and a lot by their philosophical bias. Are they left-wing, right-wing, green, pink, red, blue? And if you can do this stuff and be more methodical as a professional, you have some hope of getting more evidence-based outcomes. I won't do this diagram for your leader. And so, as mentioned earlier, social and economy are really flip sides. One of the things that does fall into that category is the arts, and not underestimating the arts when you're dealing with community initiatives. This has got a little bit to do with council investment, that you can get very high rates of return if you invest in the arts when you compare it maybe to investing in roading. If you get 4 to 1 in a roading investment or a transport investment, you're doing well. And Rob Adams, who's been very active in Melbourne, he had studies done which were showing they're getting up to 11 to 1 return when they invest in the arts. And so that's an interesting sort of comparison, and not to underestimate the arts. It's not just a cultural thing, it's also an employment, an economic thing. In Dunedin, dealing with a virtually abandoned district called the Warehouse District, filled with beautiful historic heritage buildings, all threatened to be knocked down because of the earthquake requirements. Got involved in a process there. There'd already been some good work done by a guy called Glenn Hazelton, a young planner or more junior planner, and they felt they wanted to give this more weight and take the community with them in their approach. And so I ran a process, and we sort of did the analysis and found a whole lot of existing creative arts in the area, the blue bits of arts, and these sorts of creative industries, purely of the arts, but creative industries in terms of architects and IT as well, in the area. And complicated, not so complicated process, but a process which involved digging into the regulations, the rules, doing some public realm improvements, giving subsidy to the heritage up to a point, and the net outcome of that was that these threatened buildings then have actually been saved, and a host of new jobs in the area, public realm improvements, and far better enabling planning rules, and apartments, the first inner city apartments happening in Dunedin. This was a derelict district. And the great thing was the leverage in this case was only 1.1 New Zealand million spent by council, probably a bit more if you take their staff time, 52 million invested by the private sector in an area which was virtually abandoned. And that was pretty cool. And a place which had very difficult ratings had a huge improvement of resident satisfaction in the surveys. And this thing, there's actually an article, this is sort of my article talking about just how you deal with earthquake strengthening as a tool for regeneration, and using the existing resource as best you can. So using the existing, for me, in terms of, in this case, it's a new town centre that I was privileged to lead on. RMIT Remote University on the periphery of Melbourne, but it's a city of its own called Whittlesea, didn't want to be a dormitory city anymore and was very keen to get employment. Initially just wanted an employment zoning, and we convinced them that you need an integrated approach, otherwise you're not really going to get the numbers in employment. And instead of a business park, we actually did this thing which was predicated on a main street, some slip roads. This is a very busy road. That's the ring road to Melbourne. There's a tram that goes all the way into the city. And then to leverage off the retail in a way which makes very much in the new urbanist mode, which tries to create a place with the retail as opposed to shopping centers, trying to make a town center, all the way through to some very large industry, small industry, and so on. It's got a network as much as we could, very important, and then work very strongly to get this very rich of different elements to try and have some interconnection with each other, all the way from retirement village to employment, mixed use, manufacturing, and so on. So these are all things which have actually now eventuated. And there are about 7 or 8 sets of architects. I would fly over, deal with the architects. I'm a lapsed architect myself, by the way, like a lapsed Catholic. And I deal with the architects and then have a very strong whiskey on the way home. But actually keep them in line that we want to make a city not just their prize project, or make town not just buildings. But the conventional approach would have delivered, the calculation was those sorts of numbers, up to 2,500 jobs. At the time we calculated 3,000 jobs. If we do an integrated approach, we've actually, there's now more than 4,000 jobs actually existing in that town center. And that for me was a pretty cool outcome, that you can predicate urban design in terms of jobs. And that for me is strongly related obviously to social, and these are local jobs, they're not commuter jobs. So if we just flick briefly through some of the natural stuff, this is Christchurch, that's the Waimakariri River, which used to flow you can see the city just there. It used to flow in that alignment. Then it moved many decades later to this alignment, and then they decided to build a city on it. The result is they got some of the purest water in the world. They've got about 5 aquifers under the city. But the disaster is when the earthquake actually went through the city, it sort of cut through a line there, and those aquifers liquefied. So the soil turned into jelly, really, and that did immense damage to the city. But we've done the plan before that. We did the earthquake recovery plan for the port here, not for the city itself. Other people were involved in that. But we've done the planning beforehand, some years before, which actually was very useful to the government when they then had to replan. And one of the things that one of the things that we were keen on from that earlier diagram is that, and I'm talking about biodiversity now, was to actually find ways of getting biodiversity linkages. There were some existing, and they could be strengthened through the city's actions, but actually found that that wasn't enough. And so we trying, and they're still working on this, to try and get private owners to get some biodiversity guaranteed through their private properties. Quite hard to do, and a lot of organization in order to get the biodiversity. And this is really from the river to the coast, and to connect up different sets of biodiversity. And so every time we do planning of this level, that's one of the early things we look at, and it meets with different degrees of success. Some of these processes really need buying into. At the city level, this is Nelson, which has a river and then a port. And when you measure the biodiversity reach, that's within 250 meters of at least a hectare. I don't know how many acres that is of native bush. the reach that insects and bird life have, that we then devised these initiatives which help connect up. And once you connect up, apparently the multiplier effects are immense. In the town next door, Blenheim, we've got a program called Tui to Town. Now, Tui is a very much loved bird here, which sings in the morning. And so the public have bought into that, and we've done a similar planning for there. So they got initiatives to buy up bits to strengthen some of the river corridors, to strengthen some of the road corridors with excessive tree planting, the right type, and so on. And I believe these local initiatives are actually helpful at a global scale. You think of birds flying long distances, somewhere to land, you just think of biodiversity in its connected up way. Dealing with a lot of master plans, always looking strongly at the social, the social condition. This is one of those master plans which we are working through. We've got a sea condition and a river condition, lots of ecology, some flooding, and trying to get these cross linkages happening within a strong urban condition. And I could have put a lot in about water quality, but due to time, I've sort of left that out. New Zealand is quite good now at dealing with its water quality and cleaning up water before it reaches the sea in all sorts of processes, akin to this. You have to have the right soil conditions if you are going to do low impact water. You can't just do it on any soil conditions. But where you can take water, runoff water, and take it to ground, right there, you often get the cleanest outcome. You'll be aware of Greenside Dock. I think this is pretty cool. I just put it in as a reference. But if you contrast that with Australia, where the biodiversity issue is actually the opposite, lack of water. And I think Rob Adams had something to do with this. Pretty cool that they've just taken on quite directly this issue of we don't have the water, and so let's have a dry landscape. The water here is obviously a controlled issue. Climate change, I've been involved. I've seen firsthand the effects of climate change very dramatically. I've been doing a lot of work in northern New South Wales, been pulled in this case to help with dealing with the effects. I can tell you it's nasty when this stuff happens. And there was a levee here, built in the 70s, and it got breached. And then to deal with what are the approaches that you then apply. And again, I'll leave this up for you to look at. But how do you prepare better for the next? What is the recovery response? What is the communication and bureaucratic network? How does the business sector respond, and where can they get funding and governance and so on? Lismore, which is that town you saw, there was a wonderful outcome there, a thing called Lismore Helping Hands. You could probably find this on the net, and they got a lovely national award. They went from like 3 people getting together on Facebook to about 8,000 within days, when the city and the government were still trying to think of what to do. They offered a platform which just informally offered assistance, shared stories, gave more accurate timing and information, and they really saved the community's bacon. But it is interesting in the big workshop that I ran, this thing down bottom left, that one of the big challenges is that you can't formalize these things because there's an insurance risk. So if a council actually enables or provides a platform for these people, they themselves lose their insurance capabilities, and so there's complexities to work through. Some very useful lessons though. Closer to home in Nelson, we've got a town centre that also floods, and there's not a lot of happiness out of this. I've done a whole series of different ways. There are 3 areas that flood. One's pressure from the sea. The other one is a river that floods from the top down, so they mix, so that's not good. Whole sorts of different options. And then you're working into all of these compromised positions for the way forward. which, all of these are complex. Water flooding underneath, you build it up. They're not much fun. And so we have really to focus on climate change and to avoid those things. And so a few big takeaways for me are, in the first instance, yes, we need clean and green energy, but let's try and use less of it as a first thing. And I think Peter Calthorpe's work is still great, Urbanism in the Age of Climate Change, and where he highlights for us that buildings and transport have a very big role in carbon emissions. And so transport, therefore, is integral to this whole conversation. And just being involved with the cities program that I've been sort of giving lectures into that in Simon Fraser University, trying to represent the urban design aspect of transport. Happy to share some of this with you guys. Maybe we can talk about that, Vicente, offline. And so just on the transport, also been privileged to deal with the total structure for the whole city, 30 years of growth for Auckland, and the interrelationship between town centres, rail stations, rapid transit, cycleways, and where growth goes, and then prioritising 8 billion transport initiatives integrated into the growth. And that's given some insights. One of the insights not in that project, but parallel to that, is the issue of proximity. And cities are often making the poorer day by day, just in the way that they're structured, and it's quite invisible for many. And if we understand it better, we may be able to do something about it. This is a little proximity model where the red is the areas with the least proximity. That is proximity to all the big things that matter: jobs, opportunities, big education, and community health, education, and so on. And when you look at it and you look at the green, which is the deprivation, you find that the areas with the least proximity actually have the poorest people on. So that means those people have to work 3 times as hard to actually get to everything that they need. Their travel costs are up, their access is up, and so on. And one of the opportunities is to look at proximity against land value, and to see where the land value is low, but the proximity is high, so the market hasn't recognized it. Can you strategically purchase that land and then do some good with it? Put in housing, social housing, or community facilities, or etc. Now, Vicente, how am I doing for time?
I think you're starting to lose people because people have another class
Okay.
soon. So yeah, I think it's time to end, unfortunately.
Okay. So the balance of my talk was it was going to finish very soon, and that had to do with transport. I'll probably just go to the last slide, which would have taken me back to my street where my office is, which is a shared street. It has cars coming down it, and it's used as a space. But that's where I'll stop then. Thank you, Vicente.
Oh, thank you very much. I think that the presentation was incredibly provocative for us, and I like that you bringing urban design as much more of a planning tool than an architectural tool. People tend to think that urban design is about designing little nice places, and I've been insisting that urban design is part of the planning process for a long time. And I think that your focus on on strategic urban design, as you call it, it's very important for us. Thank you for bringing that up. But let's open the floor for questions and answers. Just open your mic and go ahead, ask. We got 6 people left in the room, so Please, let's make this a conversation. Any comments, questions? Alex, Hema, any questions there, comments?
You know what? I'm having some work done on trying to keep the house on the foundation in an earthquake. So I've had the bit on mute. But I thought it was an excellent presentation and covered all the bases. And I go back to your era of, what did we call it back then? Appropriate technology, starting with sort of the individual and building it up to, like you were saying, scaling it up to the largest systems we can be involved with. So thank you very much, Kobus. I hope to get back in touch with you.
Sure. Thank you, Alex.
Hi, Kobus. We must all be of the same vintage, because that was what struck me most, was that we used to talk about what was appropriate technology, and somehow with the growth and development integral connection, we've really lost track of that, because appropriate technology was never about growth, but the amount of growth you needed for these other things that you were talking about. So I enjoyed the talk, and I wish we had more conversations about development.
Yes, and I think what's interesting for me is that governments around the world are now throwing money at big infrastructure, you know, and at propping up businesses, and all of that's 100% understandable under the stress that we're at, and people losing jobs and just trying to keep some semblance of normalcy. But I think the bigger question is, if we keep throwing all our resources now at, especially at big infrastructure, often it's just measured on how many jobs will that provide, and it's predicated on the assumption that that infrastructure is automatically a good thing. You know, you build another big road or another big this or another big that it's automatically a good thing. You know, when we in past times have looked at employment mixed in with all these topics, the employment from construction was actually kind of a moderate quality in terms of its longevity and whether it's really creating resilience within a community, so employment from growth in itself becomes a bit of a drug. You know, you need more, then you need more, then you've got to keep them going, so you've got to do more, you know. And then what suffers? The environment suffers, because you've got to keep expanding. And so I think what's quite alarming is, it's one thing if you've got a philosophical difference between a government which is slightly left of center versus right of center, and it's going to fluctuate like that. But this is happening at a scale which is phenomenal, and it's going to have, you know, 30 years of effect. You know, all these billions being chucked at you know, in particular directions so tightly defined. So that's, you know, I'm not sure that's been thought through. Well, we know it hasn't, and what I don't know what the consequences are that will follow.
Yeah, you know, you talked about the concept of basic needs, and that was sort of at the beginning of the development decades, when we had a clearer picture about development. Yeah. You know, it was meeting basic needs. And globally, I mean, I think even though the battle hasn't been won, this kind of growth-oriented focus of governments has yielded some semblance of basic need underpinning to, you know, not all the population, but a larger percentage of the population. Yeah. But in a way, that model then has become just self-sustaining without thinking about the consequences of what it is we're growing.
And I think, you know, if you think of your housing bubble and those, you know, acres and acres and acres and acres of suburbia created in your housing boom, artificial boom that eventually led to 2009. If you think of the, and all those people then going back to the inner city or wherever they came from, who had been given these mortgages they couldn't sustain and all the subprime stuff. I mean, that's massive in geographic terms. It's massive in scale. And you think, well, what if that effort had gone into fixing up where those people were living and making those areas more tolerable and more humane, and the opportunities being, and I'm assuming a lot of those people were inner city people, and now ending up in suburbia for a short time in a house they couldn't afford, and then the whole bubble burst, and you got acres and acres and acres of empty houses. I'm not saying that's going to happen this time, but it's of that quantum, and so I think just as an urban professional, we can only deal what we deal with. We can lament the bigger picture, but I think it puts a bigger. I think urban designers, urban planners are going to become less relevant if they don't have stronger connectivity and a stronger story about how what they do reaches into those lower levels of poverty. Mm-hmm. And I loved what Jeffrey Payne said a few talks back, and it was something I was saying independent of hearing it from him, was that the so-called developed world and third world, that it's actually a continuum. Mm-hmm. And you get pockets of one in the other. You go to India, you get some pretty high-level first world stuff in the middle of slums. And you go to London, and a few years back there was a big report about how many people are living in garden sheds, in gardens in the back of houses in London, and everybody's astonished. New Zealand has that. New Zealand's got its equivalent, and everywhere has its equivalent of conditions which are no different to a poor country in a rich country. But the problem is the rich countries don't have a way of thinking about that. They don't have a way of dealing with that because they're so structured and formalized, and the standards are so high. And therefore, I've always made, I'm sort of this ex-colonial coming out of Africa, and so I'm dubious in my origins in this field, and so I'm hypercritical of myself, but I think I've always, because I saw those squatter and those issues were dear to my heart right from the outset, and I saw those core needs being really prime, and when you move into the same needs, but structures which are actually very obstructive in the developed world, you kind of say, well, there's a real breakdown in our intellectual continuity. Mm-hmm. So that's always fascinated me.